The countries that did everything right got punished the most. That's the paradox of 1997. Thailand, Korea, Indonesia, they followed Western advice, opened their markets, welcomed foreign capital, built the Asian miracle exactly as the textbooks prescribed. Then the same money that built them fled overnight and left them in ruins. The conventional story blames Asian corruption and cronyism. That explanation is comforting. It's also missing half the picture. This isn't conspiracy. This is how financial systems actually behave when nobody's watching the plumbing. To understand what really happened, we need to start where the rules were written, not Bangkok, not Seoul, but a trading floor in New York, 10 years before the first domino fell. The countries that did everything right got punished the most. That's the paradox of 1997. Thailand, Korea, Indonesia, they followed Western advice, opened their markets, welcomed foreign capital, built the Asian miracle exactly as the textbooks prescribed. Then the same money that built them fled overnight and left them in ruins. The conventional story blames Asian corruption and cronyism. That explanation is comforting. It's also missing half the picture. This isn't conspiracy. This is how financial systems actually behave when nobody's watching the plumbing. To understand what really happened, we need to start where the rules were written, not Bangkok, not Seoul, but a trading floor in New York, 10 years before the first domino fell. $50 billion. That's how much wealth vanished from South Korea alone in a single week. Not over months, not over quarters. 7 days. Picture a map of East Asia, with money flowing out like blood from an open wound, red arrows pointing toward New York, London, Frankfurt. The speed was unprecedented. The devastation was systematic. Somchai Ratanaporn still remembers the exact moment his life split in two. He was 42 years old, sitting in his corner office at a textile export company in Bangkok. 15 years he had climbed to reach that desk. 45,000 baht a month, a salary that let him buy a modest house, send his daughter to a decent school. Imagine a retirement that didn't involve fear. On July 2, 1997, the radio interrupted everything. The government had surrendered. They would no longer defend the baht. Somchai watched his computer screen as the exchange rate moved like a heart monitor flatlining. 25 baht per dollar became 30. 30 became 35. By the time he drove home that evening, past billboards advertising luxury condos that would never be completed, it had crossed 40. His savings measured in real purchasing power had been cut in half between breakfast and dinner. Here's the first question nobody in power wanted to ask. If the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world couldn't see this crisis coming, what made them so confident they could manage the aftermath? While Somchai was watching his future evaporate 1,200 miles North Park, Sun Young was celebrating. She was 28, a junior analyst at one of Seoul's largest securities firms, and she had just closed the best quarter of her young career. Top of her class at Yonsei University. First apartment purchased with a small loan. Money sent home to her parents in Busan, every month like clockwork. Korea wasn't Thailand. Korea was different. Korea was a tiger economy with world-class conglomerates and a government that knew what it was doing. That's what everyone believed in August 1997. By December, Sun Young's firm had collapsed. Her apartment was worth less than she owed on it. And when she walked through Yeouido Seoul's financial district, she saw something that hadn't existed in South Korea since the war: professionals in suits sleeping in cardboard boxes in public parks. Now let's talk about winners, because every crisis creates them. George Soros made approximately $1 billion betting against the Thai baht. The method was elegant in its brutality. Borrow Thai currency, sell it aggressively, watch the panic spread, buy it back at half the price, pocket the difference. When journalists asked him about the human consequences, the factory workers laid off, the families bankrupted, the students pulled from universities. Soros was remarkably candid. He said he was there to make money. He could not and did not look at the social consequences of what he did. There's something almost admirable about that honesty. Almost. Megawati Suharto, no relation to the dictator, was 35 years old. A schoolteacher in Jakarta when she learned what honesty like that actually costs. For 7 years, she had saved 500,000 rupiah every month. Not for herself. For her daughter's education. The ritual was almost sacred, walking to the bank on the first of each month, watching the numbers grow in her passbook, imagining the doors that money would open. When the rupiah collapsed, she went to the supermarket and stood in the aisle holding a basket, staring at a price tag that had changed overnight. Not by 10%, by 400%. 7 years of hope couldn't fill a week of groceries. Here's what most people get wrong about the Asian financial crisis. They think it was an Asian problem. A regional failure caused by local corruption in developing economies that got ahead of themselves. That's the story that got told in Washington and London and New York. The Asians overreached. The Asians got greedy. The Asians couldn't manage their own finances. But that narrative isn't just incomplete. It's a lie that would cost the Western world trillions of dollars exactly 1 decade later. The virus that burned through Asia in 1997 wasn't born in Bangkok. It was engineered in Manhattan. And the men who engineered it were still being celebrated as geniuses while the bodies were being counted. The second question that should keep you awake. If the lesson was so obvious, why did we repeat the exact same mistake in 2008? Meanwhile, in the ballrooms of Hong Kong's Grand Hyatt, the annual IMF conference was proceeding as scheduled. Champagne was flowing. Handshakes were firm. The world's most powerful finance ministers were congratulating themselves on a decade of uninterrupted growth. Picture the scene. Crystal chandeliers, $1,000 suits, the quiet confidence of men who believed they had figured out how the world works. Not one of them mentioned the fire burning 400 miles south. Not one of them asked who had handed out the matches. One man in that conference would later play a role that most histories conveniently forget. His name was William McDonough, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful branch of America's central banking system. What he did in the months that followed, and why he did it, is a story that connects 1997 to 2008 in ways that the official record has tried very hard to bury. But before we get there, we need to understand something more fundamental. We need to understand how the rules of global finance were rewritten in the 1980s, and who rewrote them. Because the Asian financial crisis didn't start on July 2, 1997. It started a decade earlier when a small group of people in New York decided that the old rules no longer applied to them. They were half right. The old rules didn't apply to them. But the consequences eventually would. The Asian financial crisis didn't start on July 2, 1997. It started a decade earlier when a small group of people in New York decided that the old rules no longer applied. They were half right. The old rules didn't apply to them, but the consequences eventually would. To understand what happened in Asia, you first need to understand what changed in America. Picture a commercial bank in 1975. Boring, predictable, safe. If a bank wanted to lend out $1 million, it had to keep a significant portion in its vault as reserves. This was the brake pedal on the entire financial system. It meant banks couldn't create unlimited money. It meant lending stayed connected to something real. A loan officer would meet you, look at your business plan, assess the risk personally. If you defaulted, it was his problem. Then someone asked a dangerous question. What if we could make it someone else's problem? Richard Tanaka was a 40-year-old mortgage officer at a mid-sized California bank in 1983. He had spent 15 years saying no to risky borrowers, protecting his bank's balance sheet, doing the boring work that kept the system stable. One Thursday afternoon, his manager called him into a corner office and explained the new world. The bank would no longer hold the loans Richard approved. Instead, they would sell them, bundle them into packages, and ship them off to investors who would never meet the borrowers, never visit the properties, never know if the numbers were real. Richard's job was no longer to assess risk. His job was to generate volume. The more loans he approved, the more the bank earned in fees. What happened after wasn't his concern anymore. Richard remembers sitting in his car that evening, engine off, trying to understand what had just changed. He couldn't articulate it then, but something fundamental had broken. This is what most people get wrong about deregulation. They imagine rules being removed, restrictions being lifted, freedom being granted. But that's not quite accurate. What actually happened was a transfer. Risk didn't disappear, it moved. From the people who understood it to the people who didn't. From institutions that could survive losses to individuals who couldn't. The brake pedal was still there. It just wasn't connected to anything anymore. Here's a simple way to think about it. Imagine you're playing poker, but every time you make a bet, you can immediately sell your cards to someone else. You keep the money you already won. The new buyer takes whatever comes next. Would you play more carefully or less? Would you even bother looking at your cards? By 1986, this machinery had a name: securitization. Banks could originate loans, package them into securities, sell them to investors, and walk away clean. The investors' pension funds, insurance companies, foreign institutions trusted the ratings agencies to tell them what was safe. The ratings agencies were paid by the banks selling the securities. Picture that arrangement for a moment. The people grading the tests were being paid by the students. Nobody called this a conflict of interest. They called it financial innovation. Now here's where Asia enters the picture. In 1993, the World Bank published a report that would redirect hundreds of billions of dollars. It was titled The East Asian Miracle. Picture a thick, authoritative document landing on the desks of every major investment bank, pension fund, and hedge fund in the world. The message was simple. These countries have figured it out. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea. They had discovered the formula for rapid development. High savings rates, export-led growth, government-guided investment. The future belongs to them. What the report didn't emphasize, what got buried in footnotes and appendices, was the risk. These economies had pegged their currencies to the US dollar. This made them stable. It also made them vulnerable. Because when you promise to exchange your currency at a fixed rate, you need enough dollars in reserve to keep that promise. And the faster foreign money pours in, the harder that promise becomes to keep. Remember Somchai Ratanaporn, the textile manager who watched his savings evaporate on July 2nd. 5 years before that day in 1992, his company made a decision that seemed perfectly rational. They borrowed $10 million from a Japanese bank to expand their factory. The loan was denominated in dollars, not baht, because dollar interest rates were lower. The math was obvious. The baht was pegged at 25 to the dollar. It had been stable for years. Why pay more for a baht loan when dollars were cheaper? Somchai's company wasn't being reckless. They were being smart. Every major Thai business was doing the same calculation. That calculation was a time bomb. Here's the question that should have been asked. If everyone in Thailand is borrowing in dollars, and no one in Thailand earns in dollars, what happens when the exchange rate moves? The answer was already visible in Mexico. In December 1994, the Mexican peso collapsed. Foreign money fled. The economy contracted. Poverty spiked. The Clinton administration organized a $50 billion bailout, not out of charity, but because American banks were exposed. A Treasury official named Larry Summers helped coordinate the rescue. He learned something important from Mexico, that these crises could spread, that confidence was fragile, that the global financial system was more connected than anyone wanted to admit. What he did with that knowledge 3 years later is a story we'll get to soon. Meanwhile, the money kept flowing into Asia. Between 1990 and 1996, private capital flows to East Asia increased fivefold. Picture a funnel narrow at the top in New York, London, and Tokyo, wide at the bottom across Bangkok, Jakarta, and Seoul. Money was pouring in faster than these economies could absorb it. Thai banks were lending to property developers who were building condos for buyers who didn't exist. Korean conglomerates were borrowing to expand into industries they didn't understand. Indonesian companies were taking on debt to finance projects that existed only on paper. Chen Wei-lin was a 26-year-old loan officer at a Thai commercial bank in 1995. Her job was to evaluate corporate borrowers, assess their ability to repay, protect the bank from bad decisions. But her performance reviews were based on volume, not quality. One afternoon, she rejected a loan application from a property developer whose numbers didn't add up. The next morning, her supervisor reversed the decision. The developer was connected. The deal would go through. Wei-lin filed the paperwork and said nothing. She would file a lot of paperwork over the next 2 years. Most of those loans would never be repaid. The technical term for what was happening is moral hazard. When you're not responsible for the consequences of your decisions, you make different decisions. The Thai banks weren't careful because they assumed the government would protect them. The government wasn't careful because they assumed foreign capital would keep flowing. The foreign investors weren't careful because they assumed someone else was watching. Everyone was looking at someone else's cards. This brings us to the unexpected part of the story. The part that contradicts everything you've been told about free markets and government intervention. The Asian miracle wasn't built on laissez-faire capitalism. It was built on state direction industrial policy and strategic protection of domestic industries. Korea didn't become a manufacturing powerhouse by following textbook economics. They did it by breaking the rules, subsidizing exports, protecting infant industries, directing credit to favored sectors. The same was true in Japan, in Taiwan, in Singapore. The formula worked. But it required something the Americans couldn't accept: the admission that markets alone weren't enough. Here's a one-liner worth remembering. The West preached free markets while practicing selective intervention. Asia practiced selective intervention while preaching free markets. The crisis would punish the honest ones. By early 1997, the signs were everywhere for anyone willing to look. Thai property prices had peaked and started falling. Export growth was slowing. The current account deficit was widening. Short-term foreign debt had reached levels that would have triggered alarm bells in any normal risk assessment. But the money kept coming. The World Bank report was still on everyone's desk. The ratings agencies still said everything was fine. The machinery was still running. It would take exactly one push to bring it all down. That push came from an unlikely place. Not from Wall Street, not from Washington, but from a single decision made in a government building in Bangkok on a humid summer morning that changed everything. The date was July 2, 1997, and the men who had built the system were about to discover what happens when the brake pedal isn't connected to anything. The date was July 2, 1997, and the men who had built the system were about to discover what happens when the brake pedal isn't connected to anything. At 9:47 a.m. Bangkok time, the Bank of Thailand released a statement. 14 words that would cost a continent 5 years of progress. The Bank of Thailand has adopted a managed float of the Thai baht. In plain language, they were letting the currency fall. They had no choice. For months, they had been burning through foreign reserves trying to defend the peg-fighting speculators who smelled blood. Now the money was gone. $30 billion spent. The cupboard was empty. Picture a trading floor in Singapore at that exact moment. Screens flashing, phones ringing, traders shouting numbers that kept changing before they could finish the sentence. The baht dropped from 25 to the dollar to 28. Then 30. Then 32. By the end of the day, it had lost nearly 20% of its value. By the end of the month, 40%. And here's what most people don't understand: when a currency falls that fast, everything priced in that currency falls with it. Savings, salaries, pensions, futures. Remember Somchai, the textile manager we met at the beginning. His company had borrowed $10 million to expand their factory. That loan was still denominated in dollars. On July 1st, they owed 250 million baht. On July 15th, they owed 400 million baht. Same debt, same factory, same workers. The only thing that changed was a number on a screen in New York. Within 3 months, the company would be bankrupt. Somchai would be unemployed. 15 years of careful career building erased by a mechanism he was never taught to understand. But here's the first twist most histories leave out. Thailand's collapse wasn't inevitable. It was triggered. George Soros and a handful of hedge fund managers had been building short positions against the baht for months. The strategy was simple: borrow baht. Sell it aggressively. Create panic. Watch the currency fall. Buy it back. Cheap return what you borrowed. Keep the difference. Soros alone reportedly made over $1 billion. Julian Robertson's Tiger Fund made hundreds of millions more. The mechanism required no factories, no employees, no products, just leverage timing and the willingness to profit from destruction. When Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir accused Soros of economic warfare, the Western press dismissed him as paranoid. A conspiracy theorist blaming outsiders for his own failures. But here's a question worth sitting with. If a group of investors can deliberately trigger a currency collapse that destroys millions of lives, what exactly is the difference between speculation and economic warfare? The fire spread faster than anyone predicted. Indonesia fell next, then Malaysia, then the Philippines. Each country watched the same movie play out: foreign money fleeing currency, collapsing stock market, crashing companies, defaulting workers losing jobs. Picture a line of dominoes stretching from Bangkok to Seoul. Once the first one tipped, nothing could stop the chain. Lim Mei Hua was a 53-year-old factory supervisor in Kuala Lumpur. She had worked at the same electronics plant for 22 years, watching it grow from a small assembly operation to a major exporter. On September 4, 1997, she arrived at work to find the gates locked. A security guard handed her an envelope containing 2 weeks' severance and a termination notice. No warning, no explanation. The foreign investors who owned the factory had decided to cut their losses. Mei Hua stood outside those gates for an hour, holding the envelope, unable to process what had happened. 22 years, 2 weeks' pay. That was the exchange rate. Now let me tell you about the moment that should make you angry. Because this is where the story stops being about economics and starts being about power. In late September 1997, while the crisis was still spreading, finance ministers from across Asia gathered in Hong Kong for the annual IMF conference. They came with a proposal: an Asian monetary fund. $100 billion pooled from regional reserves to create a firewall against speculation. Japan would contribute. Singapore would contribute. China was interested. The fund would provide emergency loans without the crushing conditions the IMF typically demanded. It would be Asian money solving Asian problems. The idea made perfect sense. It had support from every major economy in the region. It could have stopped the bleeding within weeks. The United States killed it. Larry Summers, representing the Treasury Department, worked the phones. He called every delegation. The message was consistent: this fund cannot happen. America would view its creation as a hostile act. There would be consequences. Japan backed down. Singapore backed down. The proposal died in a conference room while the fire kept burning. Pause for a moment and consider what this means. A solution existed. It had funding. It had regional support. And it was blocked not because it wouldn't work, but because Washington couldn't control it. The official explanation was concern about moral hazard. The real explanation was simpler. America was not going to let Asia build financial infrastructure that didn't run through New York. Here's a one-liner worth remembering. When poor countries try to protect themselves, it's called protectionism. When rich countries do it, it's called prudent policy. Instead of the Asian Monetary Fund, the region got the IMF. And the IMF arrived with a familiar playbook: structural adjustment. In exchange for emergency loans, countries had to cut government spending, raise interest rates, open their markets to foreign ownership, and sell state assets at fire sale prices. The theory was that these measures would restore confidence. The practice was collective punishment for a crisis the victims didn't cause. What most people get wrong about the IMF intervention is the assumption that it was designed to help Asia recover. It wasn't. It was designed to protect Western creditors. Every policy demanded by the IMF had the same effect. It made it easier for foreign banks to get their money out and harder for local economies to stabilize. Interest rates in Korea hit 30%. Companies that could have survived with breathing room were forced into bankruptcy. Assets that had taken decades to build were sold to foreign buyers for pennies on the dollar. Park Sun-young, the analyst from Seoul whose firm collapsed, whose apartment was repossessed, watched this happen in real time. She remembers walking through Yeouido in January 1998, past buildings that now had American names on them. Banks that had been Korean for generations sold to Citigroup and Goldman Sachs. Her father called her crying to say he had donated his gold wedding ring to the National Collection, a campaign where ordinary Koreans gave their jewelry to help pay off the country's debt. Picture that image, a 60-year-old man handing over the ring he'd worn for 35 years, while the hedge funds that triggered the crisis were celebrating record profits. Here's the second question that should haunt everyone watching. Why were ordinary people asked to sacrifice their wedding rings while the speculators who caused the crisis paid nothing? The answer reveals something the official narrative wants you to forget. There was a bailout during the Asian financial crisis. It just wasn't for Asia. In late 1998, a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management, run by Nobel laureates backed by the biggest banks on Wall Street, made bad bets and faced collapse. The Federal Reserve organized a rescue within weeks. No lectures about moral hazard. No demands for structural adjustment. No fire sales of American assets to foreign buyers. When American elites faced consequences, the rules suddenly changed. Remember William McDonough, the New York Fed president I mentioned earlier? He personally coordinated the LTCM rescue. The same institutions that had demanded Asia suffer through its crisis organized a private bailout to protect their own. By early 1998, the human cost was becoming impossible to ignore. Indonesia's economy contracted by 13%. Poverty rates that had been falling for 20 years reversed overnight. Riots broke out in Jakarta. Over 1,000 people died. The dictator Suharto, who had ruled for 32 years, was forced from power. In Korea, the suicide rate spiked. The shame of failure in a Confucian society, losing your job, losing your home, losing your ability to provide, was more than some could bear. Mental health services were overwhelmed. Families disintegrated. Megawati Suharto, the Jakarta schoolteacher, whose 7 years of savings couldn't buy a week of groceries, stopped going to work in December 1997. The school couldn't pay salaries anymore. She spent the next 6 months doing odd jobs, washing clothes for neighbors, selling food on the street, anything to keep her daughter fed. The education fund was gone. The future she had carefully constructed erased. What replaced it was a lesson harder than anything she'd learned in a classroom. The system was never designed to protect people like her. Here's a one-liner that captures the entire crisis. The same institutions that called Asia a miracle in 1993 called it a moral failure in 1997. The only thing that changed was who was losing money. The crisis would eventually burn itself out. Currencies would stabilize. Economies would slowly recover. But something had changed permanently. Across Asia, a generation learned that the global financial system was not neutral. It had rules, but the rules applied differently depending on who you were. The countries that followed Western advice most faithfully were punished most severely. The speculators who triggered the crisis walked away rich. The institutions that preached fiscal discipline organized bailouts for themselves. And in Washington and New York, the architects of this system made a collective decision that would cost the world trillions of dollars a decade later. They decided to learn nothing. They declared the Asian crisis exotic, a regional problem caused by local failures irrelevant to the sophisticated markets of the West. They were wrong. The same patterns, the same mechanisms, the same arrogance. It was all there waiting. The fire hadn't been extinguished. It had just moved. 10 years later, it would burn down Wall Street, and this time there would be no one left to blame but themselves. The same patterns, the same mechanisms, the same arrogance. The fire hadn't been extinguished, it had just moved. 10 years later it would burn down Wall Street, and this time there would be no one left to blame but themselves. But before we get to 2008, we need to understand what happened in the decade between. Because the Asian financial crisis didn't end when the currencies stabilized. It ended differently for different people. And that difference between those who recovered and those who never did reveals something essential about how our financial system actually works. Here's what most people get wrong about economic recovery. They imagine it as a single line on a chart moving down during crisis and back up during recovery. GDP falls, GDP rises, crisis over. But that aggregate line hides millions of individual stories. Some people ride the recovery up, others never get off the floor. The line doesn't tell you which families stayed broken. It doesn't tell you which careers never recovered. It doesn't tell you which children grew up in poverty because their parents happened to be in the wrong industry at the wrong time. Let me show you what I mean with two trajectories from the same starting point. Remember Chen Wei-lin, the young loan officer in Bangkok who was forced to approve bad loans. On July 2, 1997, she was 28 years old with a promising career in finance. By December, her bank had collapsed. She spent 1998 unemployed, sending out applications that went nowhere. In 1999, she found work as an administrative assistant at a foreign company, half her previous salary, no future, but enough to survive. She held that job for 6 years. In 2005, she finally returned to banking at an entry-level position, starting over at 36. Today at 55, Wei-lin earns roughly what she would have earned at 35 if the crisis had never happened. 20 years of career progression erased. Picture a chart showing two lines what her income would have been and what it actually was. The gap between them represents a lifetime of compounded loss. Now contrast that with James Chen. No relation, a 32-year-old portfolio manager at a New York hedge fund in 1997. When Thailand collapsed, his fund made $400 million shorting Asian currencies. His personal bonus that year was $8 million. By 2000, he had started his own fund. By 2007, he was managing $2 billion in assets. When the 2008 crisis hit, he made money again, this time shorting American mortgage securities. Today, James Chen's net worth exceeds $500 million. He gives speeches about market efficiency at Davos. He endowed a chair at his alma mater. The crisis that destroyed Wei-lin's career was the foundation of his fortune. Here's the question that should disturb everyone watching. In what kind of system does following the rules lead to poverty, while exploiting chaos leads to generational wealth? The macro numbers tell the same story on a larger scale. By 2002, Thailand's GDP had recovered to its pre-crisis level. The headlines declared victory. But look closer at who captured that recovery. Picture a pie chart of Thai national wealth in 1996 versus 2002. The pie is the same size, but the slices have changed. Foreign ownership of Thai banks went from virtually zero to over 30%. Foreign ownership of major corporations doubled. The economy recovered, but the ownership didn't. Thailand was rebuilding, but rebuilding something that increasingly belonged to someone else. Indonesia's trajectory was even darker. The economy contracted by 13% in 1998, a collapse comparable to the Great Depression. It took until 2004 for GDP to recover. But the human damage lasted longer. A generation of children who should have been in school in 1998 entered the workforce with less education than their parents. Picture a cohort study tracking Indonesian children born in 1990. Those who were 8 years old during the crisis, old enough to be pulled from school to help their families survive, show lower lifetime earnings, worse health outcomes, and higher poverty rates than cohorts born just 5 years earlier or later. The crisis didn't just destroy wealth, It destroyed human capital that could never be rebuilt. Megawati Suharto, the Jakarta schoolteacher whose savings couldn't buy groceries, never returned to teaching. The school that employed her closed in 1998 and never reopened. She spent the next decade doing informal work, cooking, cleaning, small trade. Her daughter, who was 12 during the crisis, did finish school, but at a lower quality institution than planned. That daughter is now 39, working as a shop clerk in a mall, earning less than her mother did as a teacher in 1996. 2 generations, both diminished. The mathematics of compound loss work exactly like compound interest, only in reverse. But here's the first twist that contradicts the narrative of universal Asian failure. Not every country suffered equally, and the ones that suffered least were the ones that broke the rules. Malaysia, under Prime Minister Mahathir, did something the IMF considered heresy. In September 1998, they imposed capital controls. They fixed their exchange rate. They made it illegal to take ringgit out of the country. The Western financial press was apoplectic. This was economic suicide. Malaysia would be cut off from global capital forever. They would become a pariah state. None of that happened. Malaysia's recession was shorter and shallower than Thailand's or Indonesia's. Their recovery was faster. By 2005, they had rebuilt their reserves and lifted the controls on their own terms. The heretics outperformed the faithful. Picture a line graph comparing Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia from 1997 to 2005. Malaysia's line dips less and rises faster. The country that said no to Washington recovered better than the countries that said yes. Here's a one-liner that captures the lesson. The IMF prescribed medicine that helped the doctor more than the patient. And what about the doctors? What happened to the Western institutions that had orchestrated this catastrophe? Long-term capital management, the hedge fund run by Nobel laureates that collapsed in 1998, was bailed out within weeks. No structural adjustment. No fire sales. No lectures about moral hazard. The partners lost money, but none of them lost their homes. None of them donated their wedding rings to a national recovery fund. John Merriweather, who ran LTCM, started a new hedge fund within 2 years. Several of his partners joined him. By 2007, they were back to managing billions. Here's the second question worth asking. If the lesson of LTCM was that some institutions are too big to fail, why did we spend the next decade making institutions even bigger? The answer is that nobody learned anything. Or more precisely, the people who could have learned were the people who benefited from not learning. Remember Park Sun-young, the Korean analyst who watched her firm collapse and saw professionals sleeping in parks. Her trajectory offers a different kind of story. Not recovery exactly, but transformation. After losing everything in 1997, she spent 2 years doing odd jobs. In 2000, she found work at a small credit union, not glamorous, not lucrative, but stable. She never returned to the securities industry. She never bought another apartment with debt. She kept 6 months of expenses in cash at all times. By 2010, she was managing that credit union. By 2020, she had retired early with modest savings and 0 debt. Sun-young didn't become wealthy, but she became something the financial system never valued: resilient. And this brings us to the contrarian point that nobody in finance wants to discuss. The people who survived the Asian crisis best were not the ones who recovered fastest. They were the ones who rebuilt most carefully. The ones who traded speed for stability. The ones who chose resilience over returns. The same pattern appears in national data. Thailand today holds foreign exchange reserves of over $200 billion, more than 20 times what they had in 1997. South Korea holds over $400 billion. These countries remember. Picture a bar chart showing Asian foreign reserves in 1996 versus 2020. The difference is staggering. When COVID hit in 2020 and currencies around the world wobbled, Southeast Asian economies held steady. The reserves they had been mocked for accumulating dead money sitting in vaults. The economists sneered, turned out to be exactly what was needed. Here's a one-liner worth remembering. The scar tissue became armor. But the West. The institutions that lectured Asia about market discipline and moral hazard. In 2007, subprime mortgages started defaulting across America. The same pattern emerged: bad loans packaged into securities sold to investors who didn't understand them, rated AAA by agencies paid by the sellers. The brake pedal still wasn't connected to anything. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody had tried. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate who was the World Bank's chief economist during the Asian crisis, watched in disbelief. He later wrote that it was surprising in retrospect how little was learned from 1997. Much of the memory was buried. It was declared exotic. Exotic. A crisis that destroyed trillions in wealth, pushed millions into poverty, contained every warning sign for what would happen a decade later, dismissed as something that happened to other people in other places with other problems. By September 2008, Lehman Brothers had collapsed. The global financial system was freezing, and the architects of that system, the same people who had told Asia to embrace austerity, accept pain, let failing institutions fail, were demanding bailouts, immediate bailouts, no conditions, no structural adjustment, no lectures about living beyond their means. The fire had finally come home, and it turned out the rules were different when it was their houses burning. What happened next reveals everything about who the global financial system is actually designed to protect. But to understand that fully, we need to look at where we are now, at the patterns emerging in 2024 that rhyme uncomfortably with 1996, at the lessons that were available to anyone willing to learn, and the question of whether we'll learn them before the next fire or only after everything burns again. The fire had finally come home, and it turned out the rules were different when it was their houses burning. What happened next reveals everything about who the global financial system is actually designed to protect. But to understand that fully, we need to look at where we are now, at the patterns emerging today that rhyme uncomfortably with 1996. The global financial system in 2024 moves approximately $463 trillion annually. That's more than double what it was during the Asian financial crisis. Picture two funnels side by side, one from 1997, one from today. The 2024 funnel is twice as wide, twice as fast, and connected to twice as many places. The speed has increased. The complexity has multiplied. The interconnections have deepened. And the fundamental problem, the gap between how fast money moves and how fast humans can respond, has only widened. Here's a question that should concern everyone watching. If the sophisticated financial institutions of 1997 couldn't see the Asian crisis coming, and the sophisticated financial institutions of 2007 couldn't see the subprime crisis coming, what makes anyone confident they can see the next one? The honest answer is nothing. But let me show you something unexpected. Something that might actually give you reason for cautious hope. Remember Somchai Ratanaporn from the beginning of this story. The textile manager in Bangkok who watched his savings evaporate on July 2, 1997. I told you about the moment his life changed. I didn't tell you what happened after. Somchai is 70 years old now. He never returned to corporate management. After losing everything, he spent 3 years doing odd jobs, driving a taxi, working construction, anything that paid. In 2001, he used his last savings to open a small food stall in a market near his old factory. His wife handled the cooking. He handled the customers. For a man who had once managed hundreds of employees, it was a humiliation he never discussed with anyone outside his family. But here's what Somchai learned that the hedge funds never did. Resilience isn't about avoiding disaster. It's about what you build after. By 2010, that food stall had become a small restaurant. By 2020, it was a chain of 4 restaurants across Bangkok. His son, who was 15 during the crisis, and watched his father's career evaporate, now runs the business. They employ 23 people. They own their properties outright. They have no foreign currency debt. They keep 6 months of operating expenses in cash at all times. Somchai still remembers July 2nd, 1997. He made sure his family would never be that vulnerable again. This is the contrarian point that the financial industry doesn't want you to understand. The people who survived best were not the ones who recovered fastest. They were the ones who rebuilt most carefully, the ones who traded speed for stability, the ones who chose resilience over returns. The same pattern appears across the region. Thailand's reserves went from nearly zero to 200 billion. Korea's from almost nothing to 400 billion. Picture a bar chart showing these numbers. The scale of preparation is staggering. When COVID hit in 2020 and sent shockwaves through global markets, Southeast Asian currencies barely moved. The students had become the teachers. The scar tissue had become armor. But what about the teachers? What about the institutions that lectured Asia about fiscal discipline while organizing bailouts for themselves? In 2008, when American banks faced the consequences of their own recklessness, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 700 billion in direct bailouts. Trillions more in Federal Reserve support. No structural adjustment. No fire sales of American assets to foreign buyers. No lectures about moral hazard. The rules that applied to Thailand did not apply to Wall Street. They never had. Remember Larry Summers, who killed the Asian Monetary Fund in 1997. By 2008, he was advising President Obama on the financial crisis. The same man who told Asia to accept pain was now engineering the largest corporate rescue in American history. There's a word for that. It's not economics. And now here we are in 2025. China's property market is wobbling. Global debt has reached levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The machinery keeps getting faster. The humans operating it have not. Let me give you a framework. Not financial advice, I'm not qualified for that, and anyone who claims to predict markets precisely is lying. But a set of questions worth asking. First, where is the debt hidden? Every major financial crisis of the modern era has been at its core a debt crisis. The question is never whether there's too much debt. It's who will be left holding it when the music stops. Second, what's the speed differential? How fast can money leave compared to how fast institutions can respond? Thailand's central bank in 1997 had reserves for weeks. The crisis moved in days. That gap between the speed of panic and the speed of response is where catastrophes live. Third, who benefits from your ignorance? Remember George Soros, who made $1 billion betting against the bot, while saying he couldn't look at the social consequences. The financial system is not designed to protect you. It's designed to transfer wealth from those who don't understand it to those who do. Here's a one-liner that captures everything. Markets don't price risk. They price optimism until optimism runs out. I want to leave you with one final image. It's late 1998 in Seoul, Park Sun-young. The analyst whose firm collapsed, whose apartment was repossessed, is walking through Yeouido at dusk. The buildings are still there. The trading floors are still operating. But something has changed. The arrogance is gone. In its place is something harder to name. Call it earned wisdom. Call it institutional memory. Call it the knowledge that comes only from watching everything you built disappear. That knowledge is what saved Korea in 2008. That knowledge is what built the reserves that protected Southeast Asia when the next crisis came. That knowledge is available to anyone willing to learn from history instead of dismissing it as exotic. The question is whether we'll learn it before the next fire or only after everything burns again. This video was never about predicting the future. It was about understanding the past clearly enough to recognize patterns when they return. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 was the first modern financial crisis in the globalized world. It established the template. Speculation outruns regulation. Short-term profits override long-term stability. The powerful are protected, while ordinary people bear the costs. And when the dust settles, we declare the crisis exotic and go back to exactly what we were doing before. We did it after 1997. We did it after 2008. The pattern is not a secret. It's a choice. The Asian financial crisis contained every lesson we needed. We ignored them once. We ignored them twice. In our highly interconnected world, the fire, no matter how far away, will eventually reach you too.